The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was established in 1881, 50 blocks south of right here, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in the heart of a Jewish neighborhood. This photograph shows immigrants arriving at Ellis Island in 1951 under the guidance of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS. And after 137 years of service, first to Jewish immigrants and then to refugees from around the world without regard to their religious affiliation, a 46-year-old man in Western Pennsylvania decided it was time to stop HIAS in its tracks. His last social media posting says, "HIAS likes to bring invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics. I'm going in." And so he went in. He went in with an assault rifle and 3 handguns. He went in to the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, a congregation that was founded in 1864. He didn't kill the baby boy who was there for his bris. He didn't kill the boy's parents. He killed 11 other people in the synagogue, all Jews. And he shot and wounded 4 police officers before he surrendered. He was there to stop an invasion that the President of the United States has been yelling about at political rallies and lying about. What the President and our latest mass murderer call an invasion is a group of possibly about 5,000 refugees walking in the direction of the most heavily armed military power in the history of the world. They are walking together for their mutual safety. Many of the children in that march are barefoot. Many of the women are mothers walking with their children or carrying their children. Many are fathers. Donald Trump wants you to be afraid of every one of those people. Donald Trump wants you to believe that those people are capable of mounting an invasion against the most mightily defended country in the history of the world. And it worked. It worked with a 46-year-old man living alone in Western Pennsylvania, in that part of Pennsylvania that presidential candidate Barack Obama in 2008 described this way.
Administration, and each successive administration has said that somehow these communities are going to regenerate, and they have not. So it's not surprising them that they did everything to cleanse their guns or religion or antipathy towards people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment, or anti-trade sentiment, and no way to explain their frustrations.
Barack Obama was condemned by Republicans for saying that, condemned for years for saying that. And on Saturday, a man who fit that description entered a synagogue clinging to his guns, filled with anti-immigrant sentiment, and decided to stop what the President of the United States now calls an invasion by murdering 97-year-old Rose Mallinger. Someone in the congregation described Rose Mallinger as royalty at the Tree of Life Synagogue. Melvin Wax was 88 years old. He was leaving the synagogue when he was murdered. Bernice Simon and her husband Sylvan were 84 and 86 years old. They died together on Saturday at the hands of the gunman who was trying to stop an invasion. Joyce Feinberg was 75 years old. She prayed at the synagogue every day. She said her last prayer on Saturday. Daniel Stein was 71. He was killed in the same room where his grandson's bris was held earlier this year. Irving Younger was 69 years old. A friend said, quote, "He was a guy that when you walked in, he was the first person that you would meet and would help you find a seat." Jerry Rabinowitz was 66 years old. He was a doctor. He ran toward the sound of the gunfire to try to help the wounded. He lost his life trying to save life. Richard Gottfried was 65 years old. He was a dentist who was generous about serving patients who didn't have dental insurance. He and his wife Peg had just celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary and were planning to retire. 2 brothers were murdered. David Rosenthal and Cecil Rosenthal, a member of the synagogue, said, quote, "They were like the ambassadors because they were always there and they will always be there." in our hearts. There was also a married couple who were in the synagogue who were killed. They died together. They all had to die. They all had to die because they were supporting an invasion. That's what their murderer believed. That is why he killed them. He put it in writing. Many of President Trump's allies have been telling that mass murderer and everyone else in the country that Jews are funding the long walk of the refugees in Central America, and that the president and the mass murderer call that an invasion. Fox News, which is owned and operated by an Australian immigrant to this country, has been relentlessly pushing the invasion rhetoric and imagery and relentlessly driving that into the head of Saturday's mass murderer. And Fox News commentators are always quick to blame George Soros for everything, including funding what they call the invasion. They are not randomly choosing George Soros to take the blame for all the evils of the world. George Soros is Jewish, and everyone who hates George Soros knows he is Jewish. George Soros was the first to receive a pipe bomb in the mail from the rabid Trump supporter who is now charged with federal crimes for threatening and mailing explosive devices to Democrats and critics of Donald Trump. And after the news broke of a bomb being sent to George Soros by a Trump supporter, the Republican Party launched a television ad attacking George Soros, calling him a radical who finances Democratic campaigns. And yes, George Soros does contribute to Democratic candidates. Some of us remember a country where you could do that and not expect a pipe bomb in the mail. Donald Trump's first reaction to our latest mass murder was, of course, to blame the victims.
This is a case where if they had an armed guard inside, they might have been able to stop him immediately. So this would be a case for if there was an armed guard inside the temple, they would have been able to stop him. Maybe there would have been nobody killed except for him, frankly.
Nobody killed if they just had one armed guard. That's all they needed. So it must be the rabbi's fault that there was no armed guard. The president says one armed guard who was not expecting a mass murderer could have stopped the mass murderer. But he doesn't explain why, when dozens of police officers rushed to the scene knowing that there was an active shooter, 4 of those prepared and ready police officers still got shot. And none of the police officers who responded were able to kill the murderer. Donald Trump supporters believe in fantasy. They must. It is impossible to support Donald Trump without fantasy. The fantasy of the one-armed guard, the fantasy of the invasion of a synagogue by a mass murderer on Saturday was a reaction to the lies that Donald Trump and Fox News and Republicans have been telling about what they call the invasion approaching our southern border. Adam Serwer in The Atlantic writes, the apparent spark for the worst anti-Semitic massacre in American history was a racist hoax inflamed by a U.S. president seeking to help his party win a midterm election. There is no political gesture, no public statement, and no alteration in rhetoric or behavior that will change this fact. The shooter might have found a different reason to act on a different day, but he chose to act on Saturday, and he apparently chose to act in response to a political fiction that the president himself chose to spread and that his followers chose to amplify. So who's next? Who will be the next mass murderer who types on social media, "I'm going in," before he goes in to murder everyone in sight because he believes a lie told by the president of the United States? Who will be next? We don't know, but we do know that America's next mass murderer, just like Saturday's mass murderer, will be the best equipped mass murderer he can be because Donald Trump and Republicans in Congress make sure that American mass murderers are the best equipped mass murderers in the world. They follow the orders of the National Rifle Association to make sure there are no more restrictions on the weapons of mass murder that are available over the counter in the United States, that there are no more restrictions on the size of ammunition magazines that you can attach to those weapons of mass murder. They make sure that there are no background checks at gun shows. They make sure there are no more restrictions on the purchase of ammunition, including the amounts of ammunition. They make sure, they will always make sure, that when a mass murderer comes into your synagogue or your church or your movie theater or your shopping mall or your kindergarten, that mass murderer will have the very best killing equipment in the world. And those Republicans who make sure that those mass murderers are so well equipped will continue to say things like this.
Sarah, what's it going to take to stop these killings from happening over and over and over again?
You know, I think if we had a good answer to that, I think everybody in the country would support it. If anybody knows the answer, I think certainly this administration would be all ears.
Donald Trump and the Republicans have no idea how to stop what happened on Saturday. Rabbi Jeffrey Myers, who was in the synagogue and was able to protect some of his congregants from the mass murderer, but lives with the regret and the pain that he was not able to protect them all, has this suggestion for Donald Trump and the Republicans who have nothing to say about how to stop this.
It starts with speech. Words of hate are unwelcome in Pittsburgh.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.